Hello, everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a powerful story about a man whose entire life changes after one shocking DNA test result destroys a hidden scheme and leads him toward the simple happiness he never thought he could have. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. In the soft fading light coming through the cafe window, James sat completely still, the DNA test results shaking in his hand. Across from him, Dr. Trung kept his voice calm, and even as he explained everything, after the full 16-step analysis, there was no blood relationship, none at all. But because the sample had been collected illegally, the result could never receive an official stamp. James kept staring at the last line on the page, and then, little by little, the pressure in his chest began to break apart. The whole plan Mr. Huan had carefully arranged, every bit of it, had fallen apart. He let out a long breath, like someone finally stepping out of a storm. Relief swept through him so suddenly, it almost made him dizzy. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. Without wasting another second, he pulled out his phone and called Duke. "Cancel the flight," he said, his voice firm and clear. "I'm not going." There was no reason to leave anymore. The moment that call ended, he dialed Diep. This time, his voice softened, warmer than it had been all day. "You were going to dig bamboo shoots, right?" he asked. "Wait for me. I'm coming. We'll go together." As soon as he said it, a quiet happiness spread through him. He could stay. He could stand beside Diep. And for once, there was no invisible weight crushing him down. On the other end of the line, Diep sounded surprised, then pleased. "Really? Then come over. I'll wait for you at home." James smiled, not the polite, controlled smile he used in meetings, not the guarded expression he wore in front of people who wanted something from him. A real smile, open and unforced. It was the first genuine smile he'd had all day. He drove toward Diep's house, the simple little place where she was waiting, where Ni was probably still running around carefree as ever. It almost felt unreal to him. Someone else's failed scheme had turned into the beginning of his own happiness. A small happiness maybe, a simple one, but it was something he had never truly allowed himself to imagine. The wind rushed in through the car window, carrying the smell of damp soil and fresh bamboo leaves. It felt as if the whole afternoon was whispering the same thing to him. You made the right choice. By the time James stepped into Diep's yard, sunlight was pouring through the tall bamboo, leaving bright, shimmering patches on the ground. Diep was already waiting for him, a soft smile on her face, a basket prepared and ready in her hand. They didn't need to say much. Together, they headed down the narrow path that led deeper into the bamboo grove. Birdsong echoed overhead. The wind moved through the leaves with a low, rustling sound, like nature humming quietly around them. Before long, they spotted the first bamboo shoots pushing up through the carpet of old leaves and damp earth. James's eyes lit up instantly. "Look at this one," he said, laughing as he crouched down. "It's huge." Diep smiled and reached down, brushing her fingers over the smooth outer layer of the shoot. The two of them knelt side by side, their hands quickly dirtied as they cut into the earth with small knives. They worked carefully, loosening the fresh shoots one by one. At one point, James bit into a raw piece right there on the spot. The taste spread across his tongue, sweet at first, then slightly bitter. He made a face, and Diep laughed. "It's good," he said quickly, still chewing, eyes bright with amusement. "But maybe don't eat too much. We might get dizzy." Diep nodded, watching him with that warm, quiet look in her eyes. The sight of him, this city man, now muddy, sweaty, and crouched in the dirt, was almost funny, and yet somehow he looked more at peace than he ever had before. They moved from one bamboo clump to another, and every time they found a bigger shoot, they laughed like they'd discovered treasure. James began to feel something growing between them in those little moments, in the shared work, in the accidental brushing of hands, in the easy way they passed the shoots to one another without needing words. The bamboo grove slowly became its own private world. No companies, no negotiations, no pressure, no distant schemes. Just the two of them. Their clothes were damp with sweat, their hands streaked with mud, but their hearts felt strangely light. James watched Diep carefully arrange the shoots in the basket, wrapping them neatly and securing them so they wouldn't bruise. And in that moment, he understood something with sudden clarity. This quiet afternoon in the forest was worth more than any contract he had ever signed, more than any boardroom, any title, any executive chair. The wind moved through the grove again, carrying that fresh green scent of bamboo, and it felt almost like the forest itself was agreeing with him. Happiness didn't always have to be grand. Sometimes it was this simple: being beside the right person, doing ordinary work, feeling alive. As they made their way deeper into the grove, the bamboo grew denser and taller, the light dimming beneath the thick canopy overhead. By now, they had already gathered dozens of shoots. The baskets on their shoulders were getting heavy. James was breathing hard, sweat running down his face, but his energy hadn't faded. If anything, he seemed more excited every time he spotted another cluster. "4 in one place," he shouted, almost like a kid, pointing ahead. Diep laughed and crouched down to help. Her hands moved quickly and skillfully, loosening shoots wedged between roots and rocks. When one refused to come free, James gripped it with both hands and pulled, while Diep steadied the base so it wouldn't snap. Every small victory brought another burst of laughter. James could feel his muscles starting to ache, yet something else kept pushing him forward. He wasn't used to this kind of work, but there was an energy inside him he didn't recognize. Something warm and steady that seemed to come from being near Diep. She never once complained. Even when the baskets got heavier and the path rougher, she just kept going, occasionally turning back to encourage him. "Come on," she said gently. "We're almost out of the forest." James looked at her then, really looked at her, at the quiet strength in every movement, at the way she handled hard work as if it were simply part of life, at the patience in her voice, the resilience in her eyes. And for the first time, he found himself wondering how he had ever lived without this woman. After a while, they stopped to rest beneath a thick bamboo trunk. Both of them were breathing hard, shoulders sore, but neither of them had lost their smile. James leaned back and closed his eyes for a second. His body was exhausted. Every muscle complained, and yet his spirit felt stronger than it had in years. Diep held out a fresh bamboo shoot to him. He reached for it, and their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. But that one small touch sent a warmth through him that felt stronger than all the exhaustion in his body. Around them, the grove had gone quiet. There was only the sound of leaves shifting overhead, their breathing, and the stillness that comes when two people no longer need to fill silence with words. James knew then that no matter how tired he got, he wanted to keep walking. For Diep, for this feeling, for these ordinary moments that somehow meant more than anything his old life had ever given him. When they finally started moving again, the path grew steeper. The heavy baskets dragged at James's shoulders, forcing him to slow down. His shirt was soaked through, and his breathing had turned rough and uneven. Diep walked beside him, one hand steadying the basket for him. "Keep going," she said, half teasing, half concerned. "We're close now." James stopped for a moment and leaned against a bamboo trunk, chest rising and falling hard. He turned and looked at her. There it was again. That same gentleness in her eyes, that patience, that quiet tenderness. It was the very thing that had kept him here today. The two of them sat down at the edge of the trail to rest. Cool forest air wrapped around them. A few dry leaves drifted down softly onto the ground. After a long silence, Diep spoke, her voice lower than before. "If you gave up your director position," she asked, "and came back to the countryside to live with me, doing this kind of work every day, could you really handle it?" James didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the distant hazy line of the trees. Then he gave a short laugh and said, almost automatically, "No sane person would leave a big company just to come back here and live this hard." But after that, his tone changed. It softened, and when he looked at her again, there was nothing playful in his eyes now, only honesty. "Except for you," he said quietly. "For you, it's different. This work is hard, sure, but it keeps you healthy. It makes you strong. And as long as I'm with you, I think I could handle anything." Diep didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, and in her eyes, James saw something trembling there, something bright and fragile, like hope trying not to show itself too soon. She reached over and gently took his hand. That was all. No dramatic words, no promises, just that quiet touch in the middle of the bamboo grove. But to James, it felt like everything had changed. In that silence, he could almost feel a new life taking root inside him. A simpler life, a harder one maybe, but also a fuller one. The kind of life he had never seriously considered before, because he had always been too busy chasing titles, solving crises, and carrying burdens that never really belonged to him. They sat there for another moment, breathing in the cool forest air before slowly getting back to their feet. The baskets were still heavy, the trail was still steep, his shoulders still ached. But somehow, James felt steadier than before, because now he understood what the real weight was. It wasn't the bamboo shoots, it was the fear of losing the woman walking beside him. By the time they made it back, the sunset had already deepened into evening. A reddish glow lingered outside the window as James stretched out on the bed, completely drained from the day in the forest. His entire body felt like it had been pulled apart and stitched back together. The soreness ran from his shoulders all the way down to his legs. He meant to just lie there for a minute. Instead, he fell asleep almost instantly. His breathing grew slow and heavy, the kind of sleep that only comes after total exhaustion. A little later, Nye padded into the room on quiet feet, peeking over with wide, curious eyes. "Why isn't Uncle James awake yet, Auntie Diep?" she whispered. Diep smiled and gently stroked the child's hair. "He's really tired. He dug so many bamboo shoots today that he fell asleep right away. Let him rest a bit. He'll wake up soon and play with you." Nye nodded seriously, as if receiving important instructions, then ran off to do her homework and left the room quiet again. When James finally woke, night had already fallen. The outside world had gone dark, and the house was filled with the warm, golden glow of lamplight. For a moment, he lay there disoriented, still half inside his dream, until he heard the quick patter of little feet. Nee rushed in immediately. "Uncle James is awake," she cried, throwing herself into his arms. "School was so fun today." James let out a tired laugh, but his face softened at once. He pulled her close and listened as she excitedly launched into everything that had happened at school. Who had answered the teacher's question? Which classmate had forgotten a notebook? What story they had learned? What snack she liked best that day? At the kitchen doorway, Diep stood watching them, and for the first time in a very long while, her heart felt calm. James felt it too, that shift, happening quietly inside him. Not all at once, not like a dramatic transformation, but little by little, he could feel himself changing. He had lived so long, as a man constantly in motion, always solving problems, making decisions, managing pressure, a director, a CEO, a man who measured life in deadlines, risks, and outcomes. And yet here he was, finding real joy in the weight of a child's arms around his neck and in the breathless way she talked about her school day. He looked up at Diep. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes said enough. "I'm glad I stayed. I don't regret it." In that small, modest home, James began to understand something he had missed for years. Family was not just blood. It wasn't paperwork or names or proof. It was the people who made your heart feel warm when you came home. The people whose presence made your life quieter in the best possible way. Nee tugged his hand, already asking him to come listen to her lessons. Diep turned back toward the kitchen to finish dinner, and James just sat there smiling, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has finally found where he belongs. The pressures of his old life suddenly felt very far away. Not gone completely maybe, but distant, blurred. What felt real now was this house, this light, this child, this woman. A little later, under the warm glow of the lamp, Nee sat beside him and began proudly retelling the story she had learned that day. The boy who cried wolf. Her voice was clear and animated as she acted out every part. The shepherd boy got bored and shouted, "Wolf, wolf," to trick the villagers. They came running. He laughed. Then he did it again. And when a real wolf finally came the third time, no one believed him anymore. The sheep were all lost. When she finished, Nee looked up at James with serious eyes. "What's the lesson?" she asked. "It means we shouldn't lie, right?" James nodded slowly. His voice came out low and warm. "That's right. If you lie too many times, then even when you finally tell the truth, nobody believes you anymore." Nye grinned, pleased with herself, and immediately moved on to her English lesson, reciting words with great determination. Apple, banana, bicycle. James repeated each word after her, gently correcting her pronunciation when she stumbled. A few times she said the words so seriously and yet so incorrectly that both of them burst out laughing. From the kitchen doorway, Diep watched in silence. Her chest tightened with emotion at the sight. This man who once belonged to the fast, polished world of offices and city meetings was now sitting here, patiently, teaching a child to pronounce simple words. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't just being polite. He was fully here. and James felt something too as he sat with Nye. The contrast between his old world and this moment struck him hard. His past had been full of hidden motives, manipulations, and carefully arranged appearances. Things like Mr. Juan's failed scheme, built on lies and control. But here, in this small room, he was being reminded of something simple and powerful by a child's lesson. Trust mattered, and once broken, it was painfully hard to get back. In that moment, the story didn't feel like a child's lesson at all. It felt like a message meant for him too, a quiet warning, a quiet truth. Trust was more fragile than people realized, easier to break than even a fresh bamboo shoot in the forest. Nii suddenly threw her arms around his neck again. "Tomorrow," she whispered excitedly, "I'll tell you the story about the mother hen counting her chicks, okay?" James smiled and hugged her back. "Okay, I'll listen." Warmth spread through him as he held her. That lesson, he realized, wasn't only for children. It was for him too, for the man who had just escaped from a much bigger lie, one created by fate, greed, and other people's plans. Not long after, the smell of dinner filled the entire house. Fresh, stir-fried bamboo shoots gave off a fragrant, savory aroma that drew all three of them to the small dining table. James sat in the middle, with Nii on one side and Diep on the other. Nii straightened proudly and announced, "I invite Auntie Diep and Uncle James to eat. Uncle worked so hard digging bamboo shoots today." James laughed and picked up a piece, dipping it into the sauce before tasting it. The flavor made him close his eyes for a second, in pure satisfaction. "It was worth it," he said. "Honestly, this is better than any expensive dish." Diep smiled, serving more food into both his bowl and Nie's. Her eyes were soft, full of a quiet tenderness she didn't try to hide. The conversation around the table stayed light and easy. They talked about Don getting fatter and whether she might be pregnant. They talked about the seedlings in the garden getting eaten by insects. They made plans for Diep and James to check on them the next day. Nii asked for more meat, then reminded Diep to make spring rolls soon. James listened to all of it, joining in now and then, and with every passing minute, he felt himself settling more deeply into this life. The warm yellow light fell across the three of them, and the picture it created was so simple that it almost hurt. No one gave it a name, but to James, it felt complete. He looked at Diep for a long moment and thought back to the morning, to the DNA results, to the call that cancelled his flight, to the instant everything had changed. And he realized something that would have sounded impossible just hours earlier. Mr. Horn's failed plan had become the greatest gift of his life. Because of it, he was still here. Because of it, he could sit at this table. Because of it, he could hear Nii's stories every evening, eat food gathered by hand, and watch Diep move around the kitchen like she had always belonged in the center of his life. When the meal ended, Diep reminded Nii, "Tomorrow, don't forget to tell Uncle James the story about the mother hen counting her chicks." Nii nodded eagerly. "I won't forget." James stood and started helping clear the table. As he reached for a bowl, his fingers brushed Diep's hand. Neither of them pulled away immediately. That brief touch felt like a quiet promise, soft, unspoken, but real. Outside, night had fully settled over the yard. A faint breeze carried the scent of bamboo in through the window. Later, James stepped out onto the porch and stood there for a while, breathing in the cool night air. His heart felt full. Not with ambition, not with plans, not with fear, with hope. Hope for ordinary days, hope for honest love, hope for a life with no titles attached to it, no schemes hiding behind it, no need to prove anything to anyone. He looked back toward the small house, glowing warmly behind him, and smiled. This was where happiness was, right here, in this humble home, beside the people he loved.